Listen very carefully to this. Imagine this. For centuries, a secret has been buried right in the pages of the Bible, a hidden story that challenges everything we thought we knew about God. Did God have a wife? And if so, why would this story be erased, silenced, or ignored by those who were meant to preserve His word? Could it be that somewhere along the line, someone didn't want us to know the full story? What if there was a female figure, Asherah, worshipped alongside Yahweh, revered by ancient believers, and yet removed from the narrative? If this is true, how much of what we know about our faith is really the truth? Today, we're peeling back layers of history that have long been kept in the shadows. Who was Asherah? Was she worshipped as a divine partner of God Himself? And if so, why was she cast aside, her story left in ruins and her name hidden from nearly every Bible in the world? Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear may forever change the way you see the Bible, and make you question, what else might be hidden from us? Chapter 1. The mysterious figure of Asherah. Who was she? Who exactly was Asherah? Here's where things start to get really interesting. You won't hear her name mentioned much in Sunday school, but that doesn't mean she wasn't important. Actually, some say she was crucial. Asherah was a powerful goddess in the ancient Near East, worshipped by many cultures that surrounded the Israelites. She's often depicted as a mother figure, a goddess of fertility and life. But here's the part that raises eyebrows. Some believe Asherah wasn't just a separate deity, she might have been considered God's partner. Now, hold on, because that sounds shocking, right? We're talking about a culture that's remembered for its strong devotion to one God, so where does Asherah fit in? How does a goddess find her way into that picture? Well, it turns out that if we go back far enough, ancient Israelite religion might not have always been strictly monotheistic. Early on, the people who would become the Israelites worshipped Yahweh, but they didn't completely abandon all their old beliefs, and some evidence suggests Asherah was part of that mix. In certain ancient texts, artifacts, and inscriptions, Asherah is mentioned as if she's closely tied to Yahweh, almost as though she was worshipped alongside Him. Imagine that! It's almost like finding out there was another key player in a story we thought we knew by heart. Some texts even refer to her as the Queen of Heaven, suggesting a status that put her right up there with the divine. Archaeologists have actually uncovered physical evidence that points to her role. There are inscriptions, for example, on pottery shards from around the 8th century BCE that read, "Blessed be the name of the person, by Yahweh and His Asherah." That's a pretty direct link. It's like a window into a version of the past that seems to have slipped through the cracks of history, or maybe it was pushed out. And here's another strange thing. Asherah was also represented by a symbol, often described as a wooden pole or tree. Some parts of the Bible talk about Asherah poles that were placed near altars, and these were eventually ordered to be torn down as Israel's religious practices moved more firmly toward worship of Yahweh alone. But what were those poles doing there in the first place? It seems they were reminders of Asherah's presence, placed right next to spots where Yahweh was worshipped. So, who was Asherah, really? Was she just a goddess the Israelites borrowed from their neighbors, or did she hold a more intimate role in the early days of Israel's worship? And why, if she was so connected to Yahweh, was she eventually erased from the story? Chapter 2. Asherah in the early Hebrew texts, hidden or ignored. When it comes to Asherah in the Hebrew texts, the big question is, was she hidden or just conveniently ignored? Surprisingly, Asherah actually shows up in several parts of the Old Testament, though you'd probably miss it if you weren't looking closely. These mentions are subtle, almost like clues that slipped through the editing process. Let's look at where she's named outright. In books like Judges and 1 Kings, Asherah is mentioned alongside other deities and idols that the Israelites were specifically instructed to avoid. For example, in 1 Kings 18, the prophet Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel. And here's what's interesting, these aren't just casual mentions. Asherah is often portrayed as a rival, something the people were drawn to but weren't supposed to worship. Why did she hold such an allure if she was just a foreign goddess? Then we get to those mysterious Asherah poles that pop up all over the place. These poles, or sacred trees, were said to be symbols of Asherah, and they were found near places where Yahweh was worshipped. Deuteronomy 16 verse 21, for instance, specifically forbids setting up an Asherah pole beside an altar of Yahweh, as if it were a common temptation for worshippers. It's like a clue that even while these texts were being written, there was still this push and pull around Asherah's presence. The language in these passages is worth noting, too. Sometimes, it's almost as if the writers are trying to erase her without fully succeeding. They order the destruction of her poles, warn against worshipping her, and speak of her in negative terms, but they don't erase her name altogether. It's as though the memory of Asherah was too strong to fully wipe out, so they settled for condemning her instead. One theory that scholars toss around is that the Hebrew texts reflect a time of transition, a shift from older, more complex religious practices that included Asherah to a stricter, monotheistic faith focused solely on Yahweh. If Asherah was once part of their worship, then her presence in these texts might represent the remnants of that older tradition, the parts that couldn't be fully hidden but had to be downplayed. So, was Asherah erased? Hidden? Ignored? Or maybe all three? These early Hebrew texts give us just enough hints to suggest that Asherah wasn't some distant, foreign goddess. She was closer to the center of Israelite worship than we might have been led to believe. Chapter 3, God's Forgotten Wife? Could Asherah really have been considered God's wife at some point in ancient Israelite religion? It sounds shocking, almost impossible, but there's a lot of historical evidence hinting that she may have once been seen as Yahweh's divine partner. This idea shakes up what we usually think of as the foundation of monotheism, where worship is focused on one God without any divine counterparts. So how did Asherah end up as the forgotten wife? In ancient cultures surrounding Israel, gods and goddesses were often paired as couples, representing balance. Think of Baal and Anat, or El and Atharat in Canaanite religion. Asherah was a goddess who fit this role, worshipped widely across the region as a mother deity, the queen of heaven, and a symbol of fertility and life. Some scholars suggest that early Israelites, influenced by the surrounding culture, might have naturally viewed Yahweh as having a counterpart. And Asherah, with her established status as a powerful goddess, seemed like a natural match. Now, let's get to the evidence that suggests this connection wasn't just a passing thought. Archaeological finds, like inscriptions on pottery from Kentillet Ajrud, an ancient site in the Sinai Peninsula, include blessings that read, Yahweh and his Asherah. Imagine that, blessings written by real people, asking for favor from Yahweh and Asherah. It's hard to ignore this. Clearly, some people at the time saw them as connected. But here's where it gets complicated. As Israel moved toward a strictly monotheistic view, any hint of a divine partner to Yahweh had to go. Worship of Asherah was gradually condemned as a form of idolatry. The Old Testament, especially in books like 2 Kings and Jeremiah, tells us how kings like Josiah took drastic steps to purify worship by destroying Asherah poles, symbols, and altars connected to her. But was this an attempt to cleanse the faith, or to erase a part of its history? Over time, Asherah went from being potentially revered to being all but erased from mainstream worship. Those who continued to hold on to her memory faced condemnation, and her image faded from the texts as monotheism took a firm hold. This transition from a wife to a forgotten figure wasn't instant. It likely happened slowly, over generations, as religious authorities reshaped the beliefs of the people. So, was Asherah truly forgotten, or was she deliberately pushed out of the picture? The traces of her in both archaeology and scripture suggest that there's more to her story than we've been told. Chapter 4, The Power Shift, How and Why was Asherah removed from worship? Asherah didn't just fade away. Her removal from worship was a deliberate and powerful shift in Israel's religious landscape. It's a story of control, of shaping belief, and of rewriting tradition to fit a new vision. So, why did Asherah have to go? And how did that happen? In the early days, worship was more flexible. People were used to honoring several deities, including family gods and regional figures like Asherah. Yahweh was a central figure, but in a way that allowed for others around him. Asherah, who represented fertility, family, and nature, was respected alongside Yahweh by some early Israelites, symbolized in those Asherah poles and artifacts we talked about earlier. Then came the shift. As Israel developed a unique identity, religious leaders and certain kings began pushing for a strict monotheism centered on Yahweh alone. The reasons were partly political. Having one God created a unified identity, which strengthened the nation's cohesion, especially during times of conflict. Worshipping multiple gods, especially one seen as a wife to Yahweh, started to seem like a threat to that unity. Kings like Hezekiah and, later, Josiah spearheaded efforts to purify worship. Josiah's reforms, described in 2 Kings, are some of the most aggressive. He ordered the tearing down of Asherah poles, the destruction of high places where she was worshipped, and the removal of symbols associated with her from the temple itself. This was more than just a religious cleanup, it was a sweeping campaign to eliminate her presence altogether. It's fascinating, and a little eerie, to think of how thoroughly this erasure was carried out. Imagine, one day, people are worshipping Asherah right beside Yahweh, and the next, it's forbidden, dangerous even. Suddenly, she's cast as an idol, her name synonymous with forbidden practices, and anyone found honoring her could face punishment. Over time, the public's memory of Asherah faded. She went from being a respected figure to a hidden part of the past, almost like a secret that wasn't supposed to be remembered. But even with these drastic measures, traces of her still slipped through in artifacts and scattered biblical references. Her presence was almost too strong to erase entirely, even if her official status was destroyed. That's why we still see glimpses of her, here and there, in the texts and in ancient sites. So, the question is, was Asherah removed because she was a genuine threat to monotheism, or was her removal simply part of establishing control over what people believed? Whatever the answer, one thing's clear, her erasure was no accident. It was a powerful move that shaped the course of Israel's religious identity for centuries to come. Chapter 5. Archaeological Evidence, Asherah in Ancient Artifacts. Let's dive into the physical evidence. When it comes to understanding Asherah's role, archaeology gives us some of the most compelling clues. Ancient artifacts and inscriptions show us that Asherah wasn't just a myth or a vague idea, she was a real presence in the lives of ancient people, worshipped, honored, and even linked to Yahweh himself in a way that's tough to ignore. One of the biggest finds that rocked the world of biblical archaeology was at a site called Kuntilat Edrad. In this ancient settlement, archaeologists found pottery inscriptions from around the 8th century BC that read, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." His Asherah. Those two words are huge. They imply that Asherah wasn't just a separate goddess but may have been viewed as Yahweh's divine partner. People at that time weren't just worshipping Yahweh, they were also including Asherah in their blessings, as if she were a key part of their faith. Then there's Khirbet el-Kom, another ancient site where a similar inscription was found. This one, also dating back to around the 8th century BC, reads, "To Yahweh and his Asherah." This kind of pairing would have been unimaginable in later Israelite religion, but here it is in plain writing from the people of that time, carved into stone as a permanent reminder of Asherah's significance. Beyond inscriptions, Asherah's presence is seen in countless figurines and small statues. These small clay figures, often depicting a woman with exaggerated features, were common in households and temples alike. Scholars believe these figurines represented Asherah, symbolizing her role as a mother figure, a bringer of fertility, and a protector of the household. Think about it. People kept these figurines in their homes, prayed to them, and viewed them as a direct connection to the divine. They weren't just honoring Yahweh, they were keeping Asherah close in their daily lives. And let's not forget the Asherah poles. These sacred poles or trees were often placed near altars, representing Asherah's connection to nature and life. The Bible mentions these poles several times, usually condemning them, which implies they were widely known and possibly common in places of worship. To the early Israelites, these poles likely represented Asherah's presence and power, a way to honor her alongside Yahweh before the shift to strict monotheism. All of this archaeological evidence paints a picture that's hard to deny. Asherah was deeply woven into the religious practices of the people. She was acknowledged, honored, and, for some, worshipped right beside Yahweh. These artifacts give us a glimpse into a world where Asherah's role was accepted, if not celebrated. But here's the real question: why were these artifacts so well hidden? If Asherah was once central to worship, why do we find her evidence scattered in ruins, almost like fragments of a lost story? These pieces suggest that her erasure wasn't just a religious decision but a deliberate attempt to reshape Israel's religious identity, an effort to ensure that the story remembered would be Yahweh's alone. Chapter 6. Modern Christian Theology. What does the Church say about Asherah? When it comes to Asherah, modern Christian theology is, understandably, cautious. The idea that Yahweh might have had a divine partner challenges the strict monotheism that's central to Christianity, so the Church has historically distanced itself from this part of ancient Israelite history. But that doesn't mean scholars and theologians ignore her completely, quite the opposite. There's actually a growing interest in understanding Asherah's role and what it says about the evolution of faith. The mainstream church rarely teaches about Asherah, and there's a reason for that. For centuries, Asherah was considered an idol, something early Israelites turned to when they strayed from Yahweh. Traditional interpretations focus on Asherah's role as a forbidden symbol rather than a partner to God. Many Christian teachings emphasize that as Israel's faith evolved, so did their understanding of God, leading them to discard symbols like Asherah poles and embrace strict monotheism. But here's the twist: not all modern theologians agree that Asherah was just an idol. Some view her as a representation of early Israelite spirituality, an acknowledgement of the complexity in how people understood the divine. These scholars argue that ancient Israel's journey from polytheism to monotheism wasn't sudden, it was a gradual process that likely included Asherah at one point. Rather than seeing her as a forgotten wife, they see her as a part of the faith's evolving nature. There's also a perspective in certain academic circles that studying Asherah can add depth to our understanding of biblical history. By acknowledging her presence, theologians can explore how ancient believers related to God in ways that might feel unfamiliar today. Some even suggest that Asherah, as a symbol of fertility and family, represented qualities people associated with the divine in their daily lives, helping them feel closer to God through a female presence. That said, the idea of Asherah as God's partner remains controversial, especially in traditional Christian circles. For many believers, it's unsettling to think that ancient Israelites might have seen Yahweh differently than the modern church does. However, some theologians argue that discussing Asherah isn't about challenging monotheism, it's about understanding the human journey toward it. By studying Asherah's role, they say, we gain insight into how faith evolves and adapts over time. So, what does the church officially say about Asherah today? In most cases, very little. Mainstream teachings focus on Yahweh alone, sticking to the message of a singular God. But among scholars, historians, and those curious about the hidden history of faith, Asherah remains a fascinating figure. For some, she's a reminder of where belief started, a symbol of the spiritual complexity that shaped the foundation of monotheism as we know it. Chapter 7. The Controversy of Translation. Did biblical editors erase Asherah? Alright, here's a look at the controversy. When it comes to the Bible, translation is everything. Small choices about wording can shift entire meanings, and Asherah's story is a prime example. Many scholars believe that as the Hebrew texts were copied, translated, and edited over centuries, the presence of Asherah was gradually erased, minimized, or reworded, intentionally or not. But was this an accidental oversight, or a deliberate choice by editors who wanted her gone? Let's start with the term Asherah pole. In several places in the Old Testament, the term Asherah appears, but not as a proper name. Instead, it's often translated as grove, pole, or sacred tree. This translation has the effect of making Asherah sound more like an object than a goddess. For example, in the King James Version, Deuteronomy 16 verse 21 says, "Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God." Here, grove actually refers to an Asherah pole, a symbol associated with the goddess herself. By translating Asherah as a grove, her identity becomes blurry, even invisible. This isn't the only case. In 2 Kings, we read about King Josiah's efforts to purify Israelite worship, which included the destruction of Asherah poles. However, the word for Asherah is sometimes translated as idol or image, again avoiding a direct mention of her name as a deity. Over time, these translations have left readers with the impression that Asherah was just a type of idol, rather than a specific figure who once had a prominent role in worship. There's also evidence that earlier versions of the Hebrew Bible contained more references to Asherah, which were later minimized or removed. Some scholars believe that as monotheism took hold, scribes altered or rephrased certain passages to eliminate her. By the time these texts were solidified, Asherah was mostly a memory, pushed to the background as Israel's worship focused entirely on Yahweh. Chapter 8. What does this mean for believers today? Now, let's get into what all this might mean today. So, after everything we've learned about Asherah, the big question is, what does it mean for believers now? Is Asherah just a fascinating historical footnote, or does her story have something to say to people of faith today? For some, simply knowing she was once part of ancient Israelite worship might challenge their understanding of how the Bible was formed. For others, she may represent a side of faith that was forgotten, perhaps even deliberately erased. One major takeaway for modern believers is that the faith we know today didn't emerge fully formed. It evolved over generations, shaped by culture, politics, and people's changing understanding of God. The story of Asherah shows us that ancient Israel's journey to monotheism wasn't as clear-cut as we might assume. It was a process, one that included multiple influences and figures before finally centering on Yahweh alone. Some people find this idea uncomfortable, but for others, it's an inspiring reminder of the human journey toward understanding the divine, a journey that isn't always simple or straightforward. Then there's the question of what Asherah represents. For many believers, the Bible has always felt centered on male figures, with little space for female images of the divine. Asherah, as a mother figure and a goddess tied to fertility and family, brings a feminine aspect to ancient faith that we don't usually see in mainstream Christianity. Some people see her as a reminder that women, and feminine qualities like nurturing, growth, and creation, are also a part of the divine image. This doesn't mean that God has a wife, but it does open up room to consider a broader, more inclusive understanding of God. Of course, not everyone sees Asherah's story in a positive light. Some believers worry that acknowledging Asherah's historical role might blur the boundaries of monotheism or give too much credit to a figure considered an idol in the Bible. But for others, this isn't about changing doctrine, it's about understanding the complex layers of the Bible. By acknowledging the full history, they believe their faith becomes deeper and more grounded. They see it as a journey to get closer to the truth of how the Bible came to be and to honor the diversity of experiences that shaped it. For some believers today, Asherah is a reminder to keep asking questions, to explore the hidden parts of history, and to seek a fuller picture of faith. Others may simply view her story as a piece of the past, something interesting to know but not central to their beliefs. Either way, Asherah's story isn't easily forgotten. Her presence, however faint, is still there in the text and in history, challenging us to look at our faith with open eyes. So, what does Asherah mean for you? That's ultimately a personal question. But her story is a reminder that faith is a journey, one that invites us to look deeper, ask questions, and embrace the complexity that comes with it. For some, that journey might even mean discovering a richer, more complete understanding of the divine. If this got you thinking, or maybe questioning a few things, hit that subscribe button for more content that dives into the deeper, sometimes hidden stories of faith and history. And let's keep this conversation going. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Asherah's story changes anything about how we see the Bible? Or is she just another piece of ancient history? Let's hear what you think.